Walk me through that moment when you first realized that the version of masculinity most men are taught to pursue is actually harming them, not just women, but men themselves.
Yeah, I mean, this is such an excellent question because it's so often that people are jumping into these conversations, especially men. They're hearing this conversation about gender and they're thinking, hey, this is all about us getting told what we can't do because women don't like it like this now, because feminism, because all this sort of backlashy type of ideas. But actually, for me, one of the big things that we see again and again in our workshops is that men themselves or boys are like, oh, hold on a second, I'm getting held back by this. So for me, I think and there's like those two different things I want to talk about. One is kind of the superficial thing, like superficial realization that I think's been baked into so much of our like film and sitcoms in particular, like where you've got this idea that you have men who just kind of make their life more difficult by being a bit ego driven, a bit fragile. Maybe it's the dad who's like stubbornly won't do things, and there's kind of like a joke about it, you know? It's the guy who's, won't ask for help and so does everything possible, or doesn't want to admit that he's made a mistake. So will do everything possible to kind of hide the mistake. And it just kind of like is there as a bit of a butt of a joke. But I think that version of the answer, like that picture of masculinity is failing, is a bit like of a caricature. And it's one that I couldn't really relate to. Like I was like, oh yeah, ha ha ha, that's happening out there. But in a way, that's not me. So for me, the big moment really uh, came a bit later on, like maybe when I was about 24, 23. And I had my story to get to this point is that I'd moved around a lot. And the thing that I latched onto as a way to make friends when I arrived to a new place was sports. And as an Australian guy, like that was something that was like really built up as like, hey, if you're good at sports or if you're interested in sports and you like work hard at them, like you can connect with people, you're part of a team, all that sort of stuff. And I was all right. Like I was always like decent, decent enough that I wasn't letting the team down, but certainly not the star of the team or anything. But then when I hit, I guess it was like 18, 19, had a bit of a growth spurt, and all of a sudden I had some professional contracts come my direction to play rugby. And I really felt in those moments like, oh, this is like the pinnacle of what I could be doing as a guy. Like I should be attaining this thing. I should be getting happiness from it, a sense of satisfaction, all this sort of stuff. And actually what started happening over the next few years was that idea I had, that image, that like bit unrealistic sort of dream that I had there kind of got chipped away at. Like I started to see that this was actually like a professional, maybe even mercenary type of sector at times. It was a bit disconnected from, how I looked up to it as a kid when you're just a fan of the team. Started to realize that probably I wasn't going to soar to the heights that I'd envisaged that I could get to. Like I soon, within a few years, I could see that I was not making progress, like in comparison to the guys who were playing for the national team and the younger guys who were coming up who were overtaking me. So you can sort of see where you're going to end up in the pecking order. But then crucially, my body started to break down a little bit and I had a range of back surgeries. And then on the last one, I was left bedbound for a while. And the first time I got back surgery, actually, it felt like a bit of a relief. So all of a sudden, I didn't have to live up to the expectations I was studying. So I didn't have to live up to both the work, like the work expectations from university, as well as the professional sports training expectation. But then the second surgery, it felt like a bit catastrophic. I was really bedbound for a long time, very dependent upon other people. People had to do my washing for me. People had to help me down the stairs. People had to do all my food, like grocery shopping, cooking, everything like that. I was on the other side of the world from my family, relatively isolated, had really good friends that were looking after me. But, in the scheme of things, pretty alone. And there was lots of challenges, lots of pain, lots of like logistical stuff. But actually what really got to me then, and the thing that I really ended up breaking down over and crying about a lot, was just feeling like, who am I now that I wasn't this guy who was strong and athletic and, part of that sort of professional sporting world? Like, who am I, the guy who's reliant upon other people, who at the party is sat in the corner because I can't stand up for long periods of time? That sort of transition for me shook me less at that level of practicalities and far more at that level of like my own personal identity. And so for me, this was this really fundamental experience that I had where I was like, hold on a second. I just invested so much of myself in this idea that if I was going to be this athletic guy, this version of masculinity, that one, I'd feel like fully satisfied and rewarded. I didn't. When I got there, I was like, it's not a full picture of who you are as a human. And on the other side, because I just invested so much of myself in that idea, I found that when that thing, which was always going to be fragile, always going to be temporary, when that started to get destabilized, I was really in a place where I didn't know who I was. I didn't feel trust in the sense of that I was valuable to people, that I had meaning in society. All these like big questions that are really fundamental to all humans, but that we know that at the moment in our society, men are struggling with this sort of stuff was exactly the sort of things that I went through in that moment. So for me, it was that that was like a key moment where that idea like came to the surface of like, hold on a second, there's some stuff I've been told about who I should be as a man that actually have led me to a place that's not the best for me.
I think it speaks to this overemphasis, as you're saying, that we put on certain traits related to masculinity. And for a lot of us, including myself, I relate to you in that we often unfortunately have to hit our low point to start like reflecting on like our identity and what it means to be a man, but on a deeper level, who we are as an individual. I think some of the questions you're asking within that story are like, where does my value come from? How can I contribute to the world in a way that feels like skillful, like meaningful, right? But then also, what does it look like to not just do it all myself? And obviously, to the point where someone's bathing you, right? I mean, it's not like you're 80 years old and you're at one point a professional sports player, right? So I imagine that even that experience in and of itself, I imagine, was very vulnerable. And it's something I've kind of been thinking about, this archetype of, let's call it the jock. I don't know if you're cool
Mm-hmm.
with rocking with that, but I part of me thinks, is it generational? So like I'm millennial, I'm not sure your generation, but there's the younger generation that now, because of technology, is leaning so heavily into a lot of like gaming archetype. And we're seeing like a lot of these kind of like, I don't know, correlations with more like online belonging than we are like if you join a sports team and you're good. But I do think that still exists. And maybe it's in the report we'll get to that you want to chat about. But yeah, just curious your thoughts on, do you feel like that archetype is still alive and well? And if so, like how prevalent do you find it to be among, many of the guys that you work with and talk to?
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting to see how these things change, and it's but in this conversation about masculinity, like I think it's so important that we can actually see that there's not just different versions, as in you're different to me and we can be who we want to be, but also that there's these certain clusters of ideas and images, like, archetypes as you call them, that can become really prevalent and mainstream and actually start to signify something to people as a reference point for themselves and a reference point they judge other people against. I mean, it's just saying that we've got culture and we're influenced by it, right? And some of that culture is really gendered. So yeah, for me, certainly there's been big shifts. What I see going into a lot of spaces that we work in is that this archetype of the sports guy or the jock is like still pretty prevalent. We often do activities with young people either in schools or universities, and you get them to talk about like who do they look up to, and or yeah, who they admire, who they follow. A lot of the people they're putting up are still athletes. And also even on the online cultures, if you sort of have a look at some of the prominent themes there's a lot of stuff which is around body culture, body development, fitness, health to an extent, this sort of thing. So there's definitely these linkages between different generations, but yeah, it's got a different tone and different substance to it than what it used to do. Yeah. So but the key thing in all of this is like if we're actually trying to think about what's important to people, we need to actually recognize, well, what spaces are they going into, whether it's in their real lives, like in their in-person world, or if it's in their like online lives, who they're interacting with, what groups are they part of, what do they seek to get from those spaces. And that's, as you said, there's just been such a huge shift in the past. I mean, I think really in the past 10 years, there's been a massive shift as people have got their digital world on their phone right with them at all times. And that's a big shift, even from 20 years ago. And I'm probably at the other end of the millennial generation from you. You know, we kind of have seen these changes come through as opposed to sort of being raised within them, which again is a difference for the next generations.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, my sense of it is because the generation beneath us were the first ones to grow up with like everyday access to the internet and social media, which before it was just what you saw on TV. So essentially, it was a man who was an actor, an athlete, you know? And so while that's still prevalent, of course, I think it speaks to, the rise of like these streamers on YouTube and like people like Mr. Beast and like just the different role models that have taken the place alongside the athletes. But one thing you said, I just want to say I'm like appreciative for that you've given language to me about is, um, I go back and forth between like our stereotypes or essentially like archetypes, these groups, are they helpful to have as a category in how we could partially define being a man from the lens of having a common experience? And I was in this discussion with some friends and they were arguing like, no, because traits are all neutral, there's essentially no need. But in my work as a therapist and just in conversations with men, I find a lot of men actually find it really helpful and relieving to say, oh, that's normal. Or like this other guy also, puts a lot of stock in his build or, also tends to fear like asking out a woman. And not that we want to confine the definition or identity to those stereotypes. Certainly, I think we've done that for far too long. But there is this sense of meeting guys where they're at. And yeah, I'd be curious if you felt that in being a part of the rugby culture and sports culture, that there was this positive tribalism, the sense of belonging that you felt that in part at least informed how you saw your masculinity. Obviously, it got confronted with needing to be expanded through your journey of injury and realizing, that wasn't the final career path. But yeah, I just appreciate you naming that. I'm curious if that's also something that you would, yes, I guess affirm or agree with.
Yeah, I think my like academic background and my studies are in anthropology, and a lot of the particular approaches that I've taken there are trying to understand what ideas, what discourses do people have at a local level that are important to them. So this is like a very descriptive sort of a way, and sometimes those things are, you feel like you belong to a group and that group has a particular set of values. Like maybe it's a church group, for example. And you're like, oh, well, this particular church group, is always talking about these sort of ideas and they have an image like they behave like this. This is how they see themselves in relation to other people in the community. And this is what they try to like uphold, or maybe this is what they talk about and this is how they behave, and those things can be the same or different in various ways. And sometimes those groups and those ideas are really gendered, right? So you have a sense of like, well, this is a group of men. It's important to understand it as being a group of men, and they've got roles in relation to other people in their families or women in the community or whatever else it might be. And sometimes the identities that men have got nothing to do with being a man. Like we're connected to people for a completely different reason and we're seeing value from that. All of this is purely at a descriptive level. If I try to describe who you are as a person, sometimes I talk about, I don't know you, right? But sometimes I'll talk about stuff that is because of the city that you're from or where you live now or the hobby that you're really interested in or the type of book that you really read. And then sometimes I might have some things there that are quite gendered in nature that, that are important to you. And I think what can be really crucial work that we're doing at the moment through our organization and I think in society is helping individual men and groups of men recognize where a lot of those other identities and those other parts in themselves have been closed off to them or shut down because they feel pressured to conform to a particular idea. I think that's where you start to really have important challenges to like, what are those ideas that you've been raised in? Like, are they actually suiting you? Are they helping you or not? And giving someone that space for themselves to actually understand that they can be a person within those ideas and outside of them is like an important piece of work. So I feel like I've gone on a few tangents here, but for me then, like if we're working with somebody and for them their role as a father or uh, their understanding of who they are as a man is like a particularly important part of understanding who they are, that's fine. It's then also giving them that awareness that that might not be in opposition to other women in their lives. It doesn't exclude other men having different ideas about who they are or what's made up there. It's like, okay, this is a bit of a template, and you've seen it as a gendered thing, but I mean, very few of those characteristics that I ever hear any man put up as being masculinity, like, pertain only to men, right? Like, you see this broken down. So it's more, I think there needs to be this, whatever we're doing, the solution's going to come by giving people a confidence in themselves, to connect, to find meaning, to find purpose, to find belonging, and an ability to connect to some of those other ideas they see around them, but in a way that allows for the pluralness of other people. You know, like we shouldn't be trying to find like a magic version of modern masculinity or something that is going to suit everyone in every context, because there's never been a version of that that's ever existed, and there never will be. Humans are so diverse and plural and everything else. We need to be able to actually give people that confidence in themselves and in the connections that they're building, you know, and then the version of themselves they like to see in the future.
Yeah, that's a really thoughtful response. I appreciate that. And let's talk about your work with men. So you work every day with men who are trapped in these patterns and these kind of like set beliefs about who they should be. What's the hardest part about helping a guy see that the armor that he's built, the toughness, the self-reliance, the emotional distance is actually costing him his closest relationships as well as his mental health?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that are quite difficult here. The first thing at the moment is that this is such a polarized discussion at the moment. You know, like just as an example, there's like a couple of photos put up in the presentation I gave at a conference, which was around like, hey, what role can men play in reducing the violence that women experience? And I don't know, that as a topic, I feel shouldn't be very controversial for anybody. Pretty much everyone in the world should get on board with the idea that women shouldn't be experiencing violence and that it'd be a good thing to reduce that violence. And I don't think it's a very big logical step to say, if that's something that's happening, men have a role to play in helping reduce this. At the very least, we're 50% of society. And we know that most of the violence is happening from men as well. But yeah, just putting that up on social media, and for some reason, it got a whole bunch of views. And all of a sudden you start getting these comments like streaming on through, like, why are you such a man hater? Why do you hate yourself so much? Soy boy, whatever else it was. Which I actually I don't really notice the comment, to be frank. But, and I think what I know is that when these sorts of things are happening in that online space, and probably half the comments are coming from bots, and they're purposely been instructed, or they're coming from people who've purposely been instructed to say things that are meant to be controversial and attacking, trying to get that antagonism to fuel like interest and attention and all that sort of stuff. So you've got some problem with the algorithms there. But then people are just getting primed to believe that they're under attack the whole time, and that there's this war that's happening between progress for women and progress for men, that somehow we're in this moment where one person's gain is the other person's loss. Whereas what I really genuinely keep on saying is that I'm going into spaces like groups of experts who are focused on working with men and boys, say towards mental health or something like this. And we as a group of people are drawing heavily on the insights and gains that have been made by women's health progress over the past 50 years. And strategies have been put together that are actually aware about gendered norms and the way that they're impacting upon different individuals in different ways and affecting the health outcomes that they have and impacting upon their willingness to engage with health programs. And so bringing those across, not just a zero-sum game, it's also that there's huge benefits that we can get for men by the types of progress that largely women have been making for themselves against the types of structures being put up. So you got first problem is that polarization, which means people are walking into a room with their arms crossed rather than, you got to win them over. But that's not so hard, because like if you've been told that someone doesn't care about you, and that they're aiming to attack you, it only really takes a few questions at the start where you show that you're genuinely interested in a person, that those arms become crossed. If you're like, well, tell me about yourself. Like, where are you from? And if you let them say, oh, I feel skeptical about this, or I feel really frustrated, and you're like, oh, cool, that's like, thanks for sharing. That's a really legitimate feeling. Like, you know, if you start feeling frustrated, just tell me about it. You allow space for them to be, those arms will come uncrossed, right? Because you're listening and you're engaging with someone. Now, that's the sort of engagement that can happen in a therapy session. That's an engagement that can happen in group work. It's not really what you can do online. Like, it's not feasible to give that attention to, 150 comments or 1,000 comments or whatever might come through. So there's a bit of a challenge there with a lot of this discourse that's happening in these online spaces that are not suitable. Whereas if you actually got into these spaces that are designed for exploration and designed for compassionate sharing and discussion and critical questioning at the right time by someone who knows when and how to ask that question, that arm crossing, defensive polarizing, it becomes a slowing down thing at the start rather than a barrier to change in most cases. There's some people whose arms are pretty firmly crossed, I would say, and it's kind of the core part of their identity. But in the main part, people have been told that they should be primed for being under attack. And if they don't feel it, they don't feel it, and they'll react differently. Yeah, I think this is a pretty lengthy answer, so I feel like I can pause, but yeah, it's a big issue at the moment.
Things that came up for me, one, Dr. Dan Singley, he was a previous president of APA, Division 51 for those outside the States, American Psychological Association, essentially the division for boys and men. But I like this framework, he says, where masculinity isn't under attack, it's under construction, and reframing this perceived sense of threat as an opportunity to change for the better. And this is where I think the right, or let's say more conservative or stereotypically masculine men, how we've seen historically, have an opportunity to grow, which is, I think, honestly, in toxic shame. I think a lot of men get defensive because they jump right to, because something is wrong, then I am wrong as a person. And I don't have the ability just to say, well, certainly I'm human and I'm limited in my capacity for insight and understanding and truth. So maybe this person has something here, or this perspective, ideology that I need to consider that may actually make me better. Maybe I don't have all the answers. Maybe what they're saying has some validity. And instead of just writing it off right away and just saying whatever excuse they want to use and get defensive, like you're saying, inviting in through curiosity the questions both on both sides from that person. I wonder where they're coming from that, but also within yourself. So if you find yourself getting defensive, asking where's that resistance coming from? It's something I say in therapy, which is resistance is always code for I'm not ready. Now, it doesn't mean that person shouldn't be ready. There are plenty of things that we resist that we need to be at the point to be able to handle and be open to. But it gives you the starting point for where someone is. And to your point, just sharing with them like this is wrong or this needs to change is not going to be a great spot, which is, where I think the left or more progressive people need to have more understanding of. When you just say like toxic masculinity and all men are bad or all these sweeping statements, right? Of course, any human that's constantly hearing that kind of rhetoric about who they are right off the gate is going to be defensive. And it's just not true, right? You can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. While the definitions of masculinity need to change, it doesn't mean masculinity in and of itself is bad. And so I think for a lot of men who are listening, they think, well, screw that. Why would I want to talk to someone who essentially doesn't even value me? So I think both sides' main ideologies, to your point about the polarization, have the opportunity to really be open and frame this different as a dialogue where we can come together and better understand each other in a way that makes men better. And then by men being better, it makes everyone better. They start being more protective and looking out for women related to violence. They start taking care of themselves from a health perspective, and therefore, that complements women's health, right? Those things go hand in hand. But I am curious, with resistance and a lot of men having that resistance, what's the fear underneath that? What do you think a lot of guys are saying? Yeah, but I'm scared this will happen, or I can't let go of this, or what about, this?
Yeah. I think a couple of things that you said there like, really resonate. You phrased some stuff really wonderfully. Um, there's an element there where what we need to be able to do is give people that stable place, like a safe space where they feel like they're not going to get judged in the instant, where they can actually start for themselves realizing that they're an individual. There is all these men out there in the world. They're related to them, right? Like we have connections and commonalities and whatever else, but I'm also different. And there's that archetype or that stereotype or that ideal. And yes, like I'm influenced by it. I'm judged against it. Maybe even I want to live up to it in some ways, but I'm not defined by it. So for me, often then the key part is starting those critical questions on about that idea or that archetype or that stereotype. And then you allow people to understand, like, hold on a second, I can be critical of that and still be here as like a person and actually get stronger because I can understand what's good or bad about that, what's harmful, how I utilize it, all those other things. So I think that's a really important thing. And then the other big part, and this comes right to that question you just asked me, like the fear is, I think a little bit you're speaking about the need for a more conservative person to um, find that space to actually feel like they can grow and develop those ideas about what it is to be a man, change them, adapt them, make them useful in a new way. And I think that's important. There's also something amongst progressive people where often men, we like to put ourselves in this bracket as, well, we're the exceptions. So we're not like those guys who are caught in the past. And there's still, I think there's still this fear of actually doing reflection and taking accountability for where we are at now. And sometimes I think there can be a sort of exceptionalism that can exist in some spaces where it's like, okay, yeah, there are problems with masculinity, but we're not like that because we're so evolved or something like this. But actually, I, I what I keep learning, sometimes getting confronted by in this work is there's just so much layers to these norms that we've been socialized into, and I keep on finding myself in these spaces where I'm like, oh, hold on a second. I'm falling into those old patterns, like either getting caught up in my ego and I need to prove myself to everyone, or, I can't ask for help because I don't know why. Or, um, yeah, I'm willing to play along with some of the power dynamics that give me a bit more authority or credibility in a space. Maybe because of my gender, maybe because of other things that are going on. So, and I think it's just the willingness to actually be able to look at that stuff and be like, hold on a second, the world's not perfect. We know it's not perfect, but we want to achieve better. So we've got to actually be honest with ourselves and say, what I find, particularly around um, these conversations, say around gender, sexism, racism, sexual assault and harassment, there's so much of a need for people to say that they don't do this. And there's so much of fear to even look like, could I have possibly contributed to these things? Because people feel like if they discover something, a moment where they've behaved in a way that's impacted someone because of these types of things, that they suddenly get put in this category of a bad person or a cancelled person. So you have this very binary logic here of like, you're a good person or you're a bad person. And the problem is, and I see this in a lot of the spaces, if you have people who, you have a good person that can't possibly have ever done anything wrong here, it means that people aren't even willing to look at, like, what are they doing and do they need to change anything? Because even asking that question can feel risky. It can feel like what might happen? Well, you're socially cancelled and you're put in the same bracket as the worst of the worst. So like all of a sudden you're as bad as someone who's done something really horrible. Whereas like what we actually need to do is be a bit braver and create these spaces socially. And I think small group spaces work well for this, where people can actually acknowledge what's going on, talk about it, take accountability, and then change the stuff they want to change.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm just reflecting in my own life how the moments I have had the most necessary or essential mindset shifts in a positive way have been through honest dialogue with people I trust and people that are different enough for me, like someone who's not going to be an echo chamber, that I feel the healthy confrontation of like the truth within myself. You were kind of getting at this in your personal reflection, right? Like, is that my ego? Like, am I off base there? Could I really know more about that? Where did I learn that from? Like, am I saying that just so I can feel important or special, whatever it is, right? So I think that deeper introspection is where it starts. And we all need that kind of sense of self understanding where you're coming from and who you are, but not in a overly padded way that leads to entitlement narcissism, which unfortunately we see on social media, right? Oh, I've done some thinking. Here's my view. It's like it should lead you to a truth that goes beyond yourself. It should never stay insular to yourself, and having the community of people around you, which, I think to your point about people going online, like people don't have, especially guys, don't have a lot of close friends to check them, for them to
Hmm.
bring problems to try to work out, to try to make sense of, while simultaneously belonging. Oh, I get that too. I relate to that. And it's so hard when you're an individual. You kind of are questioning, like, okay, here's my experience as a person, but yet then online, I'm hearing all these different things. Well, what's right? Where do I look to define, truth? And I think a way that we can understand that is through study, which you're doing. So you're releasing a major report on masculinity and men's experiences in the UK this November. Very excited to read that. Why is it so important to do this research now? And what made you decide that men needed to be studied and heard on this? And then I have some follow up questions on what you're hoping changes as a result of those insights.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you're looking forward to having a look at it. The need for this really is coming from the fact that at an organizational level, we keep being in these spaces where one of the big problems that people are trying to solve is how do you actually get men to engage like better with these policies, with these initiatives, with these health programs, with gender equality programs, or uh, with learning, I don't know, even like learning in general, staying in school, all of these types of things. Like something's going on there. Men are disengaging, men are stepping out. We're seeing a lot of gendered types of problems, and we don't quite know exactly what's going on here. And then you get a lot of noise online, and the noise is, maybe it's saying that men are broken, masculinity is defunct, it's got to go. Then another group saying, well, no, we're going to go back to an imaginary 50 years ago and reinstate some norms that will solve the problem for us. And so the question actually still remains, well, what's going on with men? Like, what are men experiencing? How is that different across different groups? Is that impacted a lot by class or by experiences of racialization, or is it really different in the UK? Is it different in Northern Ireland from Wales, from Scotland, from England? Is it different if you're in a big city or in a small town, a rural area? So all of these sorts of questions we felt like we needed to ask to have an understanding about men's relationships, men's view towards the future and their optimism, how men were dealing with the material conditions they might be in, work issues, money issues, that sort of stuff. And really then, like, how do we take all that data and then find better ways of engaging men and build better policies and structures and everything else to actually serve different men in different ways?
Yeah. And given that approach of the need to ask those particulars, like city versus country, or actual, or should I say countryside, or different countries within a region, or regions, or socioeconomic status, why is it important that you chose those factors that you did to study? Are they a sense of like markers of like clear delineations that you see certain traits or components or resonance, like among men who live in cities versus the countryside, or men who live in Northern Ireland versus, England?
Yeah, the choices about what characteristics we were like measuring and focusing on kind of came from a few different directions. One, as an organization, we're working in about doing about 1,000 different workshops a year, right? And a lot of them are clustered in around London or other big cities, but some of them are in different areas. And we know that there's big differences. We know the sorts of lives that people have, the sorts of interactions they have are going to be very different if you're in those places. The opportunities you can see, um, the number of, like, the diversity of people you deal with is different if you're living in like a hyper multi-ethnic London borough versus if you're living in a rural area where there's probably less diversity of people in terms of background or religion or that sort of thing. And we also know from other studies and from our work that we know that men have different experiences depending on how they're racialized, how they're moving through, how they're treated in various social situations. As an example, we did an earlier study this year that was looking at people's safety. And it was mainly trying to get men involved in a campaign to help improve women's safety in public spaces and on public transport. But one of the findings that came out of it was, yes, in general, women experience a lot less safety and are adapting their behavior because of that. But the group that had the least sense of safety in public transport was black men. And like, okay, that was like just such a stark contrast in a way that, both had related to their, how they're racialized, but also to their gender identity. So we're like, okay, that's something to bear in mind and make sure we're looking for how those experiences are shaped through this study as well. And then the last thing that was really important there was that we're also interested in some of those, and we've been talking about archetypes or stereotypes. So we're also trying to look at how some of those things are shaping people's experiences in other parts of their life. So is someone's conformity or the feeling that they have to be like a typical man, or like, a traditional man, is that shaping how they're forming their relationships? Does that shape whether they're happy at work? Does that shape how much time they're spending online? Does that shape stuff like their use of pornography or their willingness to have like virtual AI girlfriends? So all of these sorts of things were quite interesting to us. Yeah, to see both how those social norms might be shaping things, or whether fathers or people who are engaged in caring are then behaving differently in other parts of their life. All of that's really interesting, because it actually not only shows the diversity and difference and variety of men's experiences, it moves us away from having an idea of all men behave like this, or even like statistics where you'd say 70% of men think this and therefore men think this, or 70% of men act in this way and 60% of women act in this way. Therefore, men act like this and women don't act like this. And some of those things are so they're generalized to the point of being useless, I think, as an insight into an individual. So we want to move away from that. We want to show the variety of actually what builds that picture. And when we start to design interventions or programs or whatever else it might be, you've got to start realizing, hey, maybe I need to be not just addressing an imagined man who's the average in everything, but actually designing things that are reaching multiple people, and interacting with them in a way that makes sense in terms of how they're seeing the world, how they're experiencing the world, what they're hoping for the future, and how they've experienced their past. That's a richer picture that we want to use to build our programs, have policies that are better targeted, to make demands of government and from other big actors that are actually going to solve some of the issues that society is facing, that men are facing, that women and non-binary people are facing as well.
Thing you said earlier that struck me related to this was that even though it should be obvious that women's safety is a priority as a society in general, that you got that pushback. And I'm curious, in your work on gender-based violence prevention and mental well-being, what you think this report revealed that will help prove or shift the value, for looking out for women and, I would say in general, marginalized people that are experiencing a lack of safety.
Yeah, you might be about a month too early for me to give you a proper answer to that. So, because we're sort of deep in the middle of the data analysis, and particular section that I have been working on, the only one I've worked on so far, actually, other people have taken the lead on other parts, has been on online dating experiences. So, just been very interesting. But in terms of what might be coming out in relation to those areas, I think what can be a really important thing here at the moment, especially in the UK context, can be giving some nuance to this idea of the protector role that men like to be in relation to women's safety. So some of the initial things I am aware about from the data is just showing that men who are really strongly believing in the idea that men should have a protector role and women should have a more servant role or submissive role, they're actually less likely to be a bystander intervening when they're a bystander in situations of discrimination. It's kind of bringing out that nuance and possibly also then trying to find the links between that and maybe elements of care or behaviors that might be existing in terms of their own consumption of or consumption of sexist ideas or promotion of sexist ideas. Is there a link there? That what does that protection role actually mean, or what could it mean? How could we reimagine that in a way that might be more helpful for like a broader social change for women's safety?
It's nuanced. And again, going back to healthy challenge is you can have a belief that being a protector is important, but if behaviorally you are not affirming that belief in the context in which it applies, in all contexts in which it applies, I'll put it that way, then there's some work to do for you to expand your definition of what it means to protect. Essentially, you do believe you need to protect, but maybe it goes in and as far as the people you care about. But the minute you go out, on the subway or the tube, as you all like to call it, and you're seeing some sort of act of violence or threat happening, that definition of protector applies just as much to that too. But if you don't have a value for greater society within that definition, then you're not going to act. And then that's actually on you to say, I can't pick and choose when this applies to me. And I think that's the biggest thing we need to shift away from with all these definitions is it's not that they're innately bad. They become negative when we try to control the definition and application of them instead of navigating the complexities of how it applies and continually working towards the truth of a greater expansion of those definitions so that we can more holistically, live them out.
Uh, Yeah, and I think in relation here, there's also that need to understand um, that whatever idea about protector is taken forward, it needs to recognize that this is like exists within a gender power dynamic and like a history of sexism that needs to get challenged. As an example, a big part of that, you only protect the people who you're related to, is this idea that women's only value is in relation to the men who are their relatives or their partner, which is incredibly sexist and is at root of a lot of misogyny and but is quite core to, in a subtle way, a lot of the behaviors and ideas that might come through, even in this kind of quite, seemingly positive discussion. Or similarly, if you don't have that recognition of some of these broader cultural systemic issues, then people aren't willing to step in when all their buddies on the chat, on the gaming channel or whatever they're on, are making a whole bunch of sexist jokes because they're like, well, that's not protection, that's just me, and that's just like stuff in the background. But those jokes are what makes it feel like it's permissible for someone to actually act on stuff, that someone is less valuable than them, that a woman in the street is not as worthy of respect as someone else would be. Each joke makes it slightly more likely that someone is going to actually act on that and harass someone or make that joke directly to someone or, touch someone or feel that they can coerce and control somebody and get away with it. Uh, Again, if we like it's the nuance of it. But it also needs to be that nuance in relation to these broader social structures that we live within.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think amidst the nuance, there is a deep desire for many men, including myself, to have some evolving definition of masculinity that feels trustworthy. If you could redefine what it actually means to be a man, particularly for the younger generation, so I guess anyone Gen Z or younger, not performatively, but in terms of what creates a good life and genuine strength and clear authentic, what would that look like?
Yeah. You know what? I think that at a really personal level, it's about getting the message across that you don't have to achieve things the whole time to actually be like a worthy human. That goes for you and that goes for other people. Like it's great if you're making contributions or if you find joy in bettering yourself. That's wonderful, but you don't need to do that to prove yourself. And that just takes a lot of the um, some of the like really negative pressures off people. And then I I would be emphasizing to people a lot about connection and care. and again, that they don't need to forge this path, which is like really individual. And that if you start putting it, in the terms of, well, let's actually start building good networks and connections with other people, then you have to be actually interested in hearing what they're saying and their experiences. And then from that, we're going to be able to work towards all of these really important things of creating like a more equitable society, a more inclusive society, because we're actually going to be interested in investing in those relationships and seeing ourselves in relation to other people always. So that's where I would go, you know, take the pressure off. You don't need to prove yourself the whole time, and focus on building those relationships.
Yeah, I appreciate you naming that. I personally struggle with the ambition part of things. Part of it is a trauma response, right? Of this, just things that have happened to me in the past that have felt like void of affirming my value beyond what I do, and also getting rewarded by society in working hard and accomplishing and success, which is obviously a hyper westernized, way of thinking. And then that second one with community, I think you're right. I mean, we know this from the studies on longevity that a core component outside of, obviously eating healthy and movement is social bonds. And this is why women consistently outlive men, because they just spend more time socializing, enjoying each other's company, not for the sake of debate or to talk about what we're growing in, or to be right, or even to talk about the game, but really to have those deep connections. So, Dan, thanks for all your insights today and your thoughts. It's been such a joy and pleasure to chat. Very excited for the report. And yeah, again, curious where people can find you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Wes. It's been wonderful to hear your views on everything. It's really good. Like, we obviously work in similar areas, like working with men and boys, but you're doing a work, it seems more at that one-to-one level, and then you build like a different framework, and then I'm working more with groups, and you have slightly different approaches, and so it's good to sort of connect and share. And if people are interested, we're on different socials, and if you look up Beyond Equality, you'll be able to find us, Scram and LinkedIn in particular.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, Dan, I couldn't agree more. I mean, this is part of why I started the podcast, is to start to create a network of people in this space so we can understand what work we're doing, support the meaningful efforts like people such as yourself and your organization, and kind of go hand in hand as we trudge forth for the good of men. So thank you for your work and what you do.
Thank you very much, Wes.
All right, guys, until next time.